Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler Welsh, coming to you from Tamakipi, Auckland in New Zealand.
And I'm Zach Semke, coming to you from Seattle, Washington on the Salish Sea.
The Sailor Sea, you were out sailing a little while back.
I was. In fact, I'm going sailing again today. I've been going sailing every week with one night a week with my brother on the Puget Sound, now known as the Salish Sea, and it's been great. Nice.
Yeah. Can't say I've been out on the water much. Been in the water, but not out on the water. But nevertheless, it's getting cold here too. And it's officially winter now for us. So,
yeah.
Yep. All right. But we're going to be talking about Australia this week, or talking to a bunch of people who were recently at the Thrive Passivhaus House Conference in Melbourne, which I unfortunately missed, which is completely my fault. But big thanks to Andy Marlow, who put together this great collection of people. He gathered them all up immediately after day 2 of the event and got them in a room, and we got a quick response straight away after day 2, which was really great to sort of get a good flavour of what's going on there. So looking forward to, we've got sort of a whole series of short chats with people directly after the Thrive Passive House event. But before we get into that, I've got a few people to thank.
We do indeed. So a big thank you to the fine organizations that make everything that we do at Passive House Accelerator possible. So a big thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Thank you to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Glavel, Ingui Architecture, Minotaur, Partel, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. And thanks to our champion sponsors, Bewizo, Gradient, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, PH Air Seal, and Source 2050.
Right, we're going to jump straight into the series of interviews that I had with people who are live at Thrive. But we're going to go straight through to that. But what else have we got coming up, Zach?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to say this is such a cool format for the episode. So I'm really excited for everybody to be able to hear it and hear from all these leaders in the Australian passive house scene. And you wrap it up really nicely at the end there. So I think we'll just we'll do the event estimate now, and that is that this week at Passive House Accelerator Live on Wednesday, June 12th, we're joined by Radna Sashena of Atelier 10, and she will be presenting Getting the Wellness into the Passive House. So please join us for that and enjoy this great episode.
Welcome to this special episode of the Passive House podcast. Thank you very much to Andy Marlow of Envirotecture, who helped get this together, despite me not being able to be there at Thrive in Sydney, Australia. Andy managed to collect together a bunch of speakers and attendees of the conference, and we got to catch up very briefly immediately after day 2 to capture some of the highlights from people who were there, and I got a real sense of kind of the atmosphere, the general themes from the event, and some insights from some of the speakers and attendees. So here they are. Hope you enjoy this. And once again, thanks to Andy and also Talina, who feature on this episode, but for helping to get this organised. We start out with Joseph Karten. Joe has a deep focus on decarbonising and enabling a circular economy. He has international corporate experience developing and implementing sustainability strategies. In his day job, Joe is the head of sustainability and social impact at the Australian construction firm Built. He is the current board chair for the Australian Passive House Association.
So my name is Joe Karten. I chair the Australian Passive House Association, and I'm also head of sustainability and social impact for a national construction company called Built.
And what are your big takeaways from Thrive? You've been there for the 2 days.
Yeah, look, another fantastic conference. A bunch of really passionate people getting together to talk about how we make Passive House a reality for all Australians. I think healthy, comfortable homes was a theme that came up a lot. There were a couple of quotes that I wouldn't mind mentioning that I really, really
Sure.
liked. Timothy Locke was a keynote speaker from the States, and he mentioned that the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. And that really, really resonated with me. What he said of climate change is that the planet will be okay. We may not. So I thought some of these things were just, they were really beautiful ideas. Julia Bennett's another keynote speaker internationally, talked about the importance of education and upskilling trades to be able to deliver on new building code requirements for Passive House, which we've now seen Scotland take up. And the opportunity to reinvent the character of construction, right? This real going back to reconnecting with construction professionals as craftspeople, right? As artists. And I just love that, elevating how we think about builders and tradies.
Yeah.
What were some of the other big ones? Priya Gandhi mentioned, what's the point of a building that doesn't improve the lives of people? Definitely. And she had a call to action around making submissions to government. We talk about the Australian Construction Codes Board and the National Construction Code updates. Well, we all need to be making submissions. We need to be writing in and saying, we demand better building codes. What we got now isn't good enough. We can go harder. But the government needs to hear from us, right? They really do need to hear from us.
Yeah, and just picking up on that and putting it into context, that is a thing that happens in Australia, right? You have a regular cycle, is it every 2 years or 3 years of code updates?
That's right, yeah.
And there is an opportunity each time for consultation, for feedback?
That's right. They always open it up for public consultation. What I hear is they don't get a whole lot of feedback. And certainly a lot of time what they'll get feedback from the likes of the different building associations. But we'll definitely put forward a submission as the APA. But we just need to hear from all the professionals, especially those Passive House professionals, to say we want better, we want more, because often the advice they get is more energy efficiency is going to make it more costly to build. It's going to be a barrier to construct. Don't make it harder for us. And that's not what they need to be hearing. And
it's very easy in these conferences. There's real buzz and all the things that you're saying around making buildings better, using craft. It totally makes sense. How do we get that message out to the everyday builder who wasn't in the room during the conference?
Well, I think we need to get the message. Working for a builder, I think we need to get the message out to the everyday client. This really does start with the project proponent saying, what I want is a building that I can be comfortable in, healthy in, that's resilient to future climate change shocks, right? That responds to grid resilience, that does all these things that we know we need to do. So we need to bring our clients along on the journey. But we first and foremost, we need those clients saying, this is what we want. So I think the opportunity...
Those two things that you mentioned around comfort and grid resilience, Is that changing? Are we getting better in the passive house community at communicating those advantages in warmer climates?
It's a good question. Yeah. I don't know if I could say that we heard about it today, right? So for me, that was it really connected the dots. I think that, hey, passive house is a solution to that grid resilience. Now, warm climate, cool climate, I don't think it matters if we're reducing the amount of energy needed to heat and cool the building, or if we're creating a building that has a comfortable indoor environment that's quite even. We're obviously reducing the energy consumption and reduces that spike in the morning and the end of day.
Yeah,
starts to
awesome.
Flatten out that duck curve.
So Joe, where to from here? How is APA going? How's Passive House? What's in store for the next 12 months for Passive House in Australia?
Well, I'll tell you what, at the end of the next 12 months, we're going to have another Thrive conference, and it's going to be in Melbourne again. So I'm really excited about that.
Melbourne again? Awesome.
Again, yeah, we've locked it in. But I'm just so excited with the growth. We've had a 43% growth in membership. We have 62 individuals from, I think it's 51 distinct organizations, all joined up in the Passive House Incubator. And the idea there is to really educate clients. So they're all from client organizations. And so we are giving them a whole lot of education around Passive House they can bring back to their organizations and really, really push that message.
Emilia Lacovino has a background in electrical engineering with nearly a decade of experience with the Ford Motor Company of Australia, after which she turned to energy efficiency and sustainable energy engineering. In 2019, Emilia joined Luke Plowman at Detailed Green, and she became the Australia's 4th Passive House certifier. Tell me a bit more about diversity. I mean, I remember Thrive last year. One of the things that really stood out for me was seeing the confirmation of, I think, a growing confidence of what Passive House looks like in Australia, particularly responding to warmer climates, fire, and a different aesthetic, definitely its own look and feel that's not European. Did you get any sense of that this year?
Yeah, we did. And we did actually have some presentations about cultural differences as well, and how that actually might be causing some issues in the certification process. So that was interesting too. And we did actually have our first certifier panel this time. And so, yeah, we had an opportunity to talk about upcoming projects and how many projects we're working on, and also kind of a bit more education about what we provide as a service through certification, but also an acknowledgement that we're not getting everything right and there's definitely room for improvement to try and streamline certification and make it a shorter process, and really that there's quite a bit of a gap between both the tradesperson course and the designer course and what you actually need to do to certify a building. So really that's what I think that the certifiers, we're all going to take that on board, and we've been asked to make some videos because there's lots of spreadsheets and lots of checklists and, lots of very engineering type of things. But, yeah, really would be good to have some more visual aids to really assist.
Very encouraging to have enough certifiers in Australia to have a panel. That's quite a thing. Yes. That's saying something to be able to do that. Tell me more about those cultural challenges. What were some of the things that are cropping up there?
So it's cropping up a lot about even if the drawings have the details that have been approved in pre-construction reviews by the certifier, that sometimes the builders aren't following those details. And unless there is specifically someone assigned on site to review those details, then they could potentially be missed and not seen until the final certification review once it's too late to rectify them.
Right.
So that's really the main thing. It really came down to making sure there's somebody on site who understands what photos they need to do and understands that they need to read the documentation. And if they want to do something different, it needs to be approved by the passive house designer before it's done.
Right, okay.
Or any.
So it's the culture of the building industry and sort of quality assurance on site.
Yeah. And I think we've, a standard build often lacks so many details. It's often left up to the builder to decide how they're going to build them. So that's how they've been used to working. So it is a shift for the builders.
Yeah. I know here in New Zealand, we've only got, we've still got a few certifiers, there are 3 or 4, and they're starting to work earlier on in projects.
Yeah.
Is that happening in Australia as well, where you know about what's coming? And if so, do you know what's coming in the next little while? Have you got quite a few projects coming through the pipework?
So Marcus, Luke and I have 260 open assessments at the moment.
That's huge.
Yeah, it is huge. So we're very happy that Stuart's on board now. I mean, Scott's on board. And, because he can start picking up some new projects coming our way.
Nice.
So it's really good.
So, that sounds like things are looking up. How do you feel about the next, say, 12 months for Passive House in Australia?
Yeah, very excited. There's some exciting projects coming up, ones that we couldn't talk about at the conference because they're under confidentiality agreements. And so just, really, really exciting stuff. And a lot more repeated houses too, where people are using the same detailing again and again. So really making that certification process simple because they can reuse their thermal bridge models and the builders, then they've got the same tradespeople building to the same standard each time. So it's really meaning they're upscaling from doing, 1 or 2 houses a year to 3 or 4 houses a year. So if we're getting double the number of passive houses built every year, then that's awesome.
Yeah. And just finally, it's big country, a long way between Sydney and Perth and Hobart up to Darwin. Have you got the whole country covered?
I think so. There are some new projects. We've got actually our first hot passive house, hot climate project up in Queensland. So there we are starting to get more spread of projects. We talked about that too. It really is expanding across. Still really coastal based, I guess, where all the population is.
Yep.
Yeah, starting to get a few more inland hot projects, which is great, and more Queensland-based projects, which is also great to have Scott on board because he's up in northern New South Wales, very familiar, more familiar with those warmer climates too.
Hamish White builds beautiful, high-performing, energy-efficient homes around Victoria, Australia. He is the Managing Director of Sanctum Homes.
So my name's Hamish. I'm the owner of Sanctum Homes, and we only build high-performance and passive house.
And you were certainly a highlight for me, seeing some of the projects that you've worked on previously. Of course, we caught up, had an in-depth session. What have been the highlights for you being in Melbourne over the last 2 days?
Well, firstly, just going on from a conversation we touched on last time we caught up, we actually have our Hempcrete house certified now. So it was the first certified Hempcrete Passive House in the Southern Hemisphere. But I have just found out there's going to be another one very, very soon, which is incredibly exciting. I think similar to last year, some of the highlights, the biggest highlight for me is just hearing about the importance of collaboration and everyone just talking about the importance of everyone being there from the beginning, like including the builder, including the passive house designer, the interior designer, landscape designer, engineer, and obviously the architect as well. And that certainly rings true with our business, and we've seen success in that. And it's just really fantastic to hear that echoed through the rest of the presenters.
Nice. What were some of your favourite projects presented?
Sven from Maxa Design, he came up with some really interesting talking points about the certification process, and talked about maybe the disconnect between the design or the design and then actual execution on site. and whether or not there should be checkpoints throughout the construction period from part of the design team.
Right.
And I know from my experience being a builder, sometimes you forget about these things. You're like, oh, shit, I better go back and take a picture of that. Where maybe if you had some very clear checkpoints along the way that's pre-discussed before you start, could be a really good starting point.
Yep.
And I was discussion about getting the certifiers out to site, but given the amount of projects and the exponential growth of Passive House, I think putting all that onus onto 5 people might be impossible. But
Right.
it has, in my mind, raised a pretty important question that I think needs to be answered.
Yep. Yep. And how are things tracking for Sanctum? Are you're busy? I mean, we're getting a bit of a sort of a plateau just in the industry in general, but how are things looking for you?
So currently we've got 4 projects on site, but they all finish within the next 6 to 8 weeks, and that's not planned.
Right.
We've got another project starting in about a month, and then we've got a little bit of a quiet spell for 3 or 4 months, and then we kick off another few projects towards the back end of the year. What we are finding, though, is we've had a heap of inquiry this year, maybe 17 to 20 new solid inquiries from January 1st this year. And I guess it shows a little bit more confidence coming back into the market. So I'm pretty confident, next year's going to be on the up. And even though we're super busy on site now, might have a quiet period for 3 or 4 months, I definitely see that picking back up again. Consumer confidence, interest rates have stabilised. Construction costs appear to have stabilised as well. And I feel that clients have had, I guess, that cost to build recalibrated in their minds. So we're not constantly letting them down with a price that is has a bit of disconnect from their idea of time versus budget.
Well, I look forward to coming and visiting and experiencing some of your houses. Go and maybe have a little bit of a tour. Keep up the good work.
Thanks, mate. Great to see you again. Cheers, mate.
All right. Cheers, Hamish. Kristie Wulf likes to combine natural materials with high-performance building. She's a certified passive house designer based in New South Wales and has experience working with hempcrete, earth, straw bale and other natural building materials. Kristie is the principal designer at Shelter Building Design and founder of the Australian Hemp Building Directory.
So hi, yes, I'm Kristie Wulf. I am from Shelter Building Design. I'm a building designer and also a certified passive house designer. And I have a particular speciality in the sense that I come from a background of natural building. So when you have questions about sort of hempcrete and that sort of thing, that's the kind of thing I'm doing.
Yeah, so tell us a bit more about hempcrete in Australia.
So in terms of that, hempcrete's really taking off in terms of just general sort of building. But now, yes, we have Hamish having done the first certified passive house hempcrete in Victoria. There's another one that's been built in Tasmania. I'm not quite sure if that's certified. And I'm just about to get the first one, Hempcrete's Passive House certified in New South Wales.
Nice. Fresh off the back of 2 days, the conference, what were highlights for you?
Well, for me, I think it was actually some of the focus on health. So I actually came to Passive House really from an environmental point of view about energy efficiency and low embodied energy homes and that sort of thing. But this conference, I think it was some of the things about both health and also the real life experience of people in houses. There was a particularly interesting presentation by Marilise Mercica, who is actually a respiratory nurse who's now working with Blue Eco Homes. And she actually did, it was quite a small study really looking at one particular person, but looking at the impact of that particular person who was living in a relatively new apartment in Western Sydney and was suffering from some quite serious sort of respiratory issues. And then that particular person had the opportunity of going and staying in a passive house for a month. And so she actually tracked what the symptoms were by using sort of medical questionnaires and those sorts of things to see how that changed. And then that particular person then also then had to go back to that Western Sydney apartment and could sort of see how that changed. The outcome of all of that was, of course, that the person moved out of that Western Sydney apartment when they really looked at how that was affecting them. And they also did an analysis looking at what was happening in that particular apartment. There was high levels of moisture and humidity. They did some testing and it was very high for aspergillus, very high for CO2. So what was really interesting was seeing this real life data presented and the comparison between a code compliant, relatively new apartment and the passive house. And looking at the differences in terms of CO2 levels, nitrous oxide, ozone, all of those things was just absolutely fascinating, even though it was a very small sort of study, but just looking at what the difference between code compliant and passive house was.
And aspergillus, you mentioned that's the nasty black mold, right? That can really cause respiratory problems. That is fascinating because we hear these anecdotes all the time. Well, I often hear of stories of people who have either come to Australia or New Zealand from places that have central heating or something, and their kids are suddenly sick, or the other way around, where they move into a home and suddenly things clear up. But you don't often have those people followed around by someone who has the skills and ability to do some data collection. So that does sound fascinating, and it would be great to expand on that to gather more of that and more evidence. Because I feel like we suspect those results, but we need the data.
I think it was particularly interesting because Marilise had that background in respiratory medicine. I think she's going to be presenting that, like writing that up as a paper, so that hopefully that will get a greater sort of exposure. The other really great one was, again, another sort of, I suppose, home experiment, which was Joel Seagren and Cameron Munro from Fantech were looking at range hoods and the difference between recirculating range hoods and venting range hoods, which is quite an issue, particularly in Australia, because our building code is now making venting range hoods required, and so it'll be increasingly difficult for the recirculating range hoods. So they actually did some testing with basically frying an egg and in different houses in different conditions, and collected up that data. So they were just using a indoor air quality monitor to register in things in terms of particulates and how quickly each of those removed the particulates from the air. And again, it's one of those things that when research is actually carried out, you sometimes get results which are a little bit unexpected. And for me, I thought the interesting one was that they found that the recirculating range hoods were actually better at removing the spike of particulates caused by that frying quicker. And it's probably because they had a higher sort of fan speed. But ultimately, the type of exhaust fans that let the air out were better at removing the particulates from the air and returning that air to like pre-cooking levels.
Right.
So it's sort of a difference. So it's really one of those things that great to be able to look at what is happening with that real life data in terms of the air quality.
Yeah, that does sound interesting because there's a lot going on there, and one end of the industry, I imagine, is just starting out on the idea of perhaps it's good to have extraction, and then you've got the passive house end of things where recirculating. There's a bit of an ongoing debate about the value of recirculating range hoods accompanied with a very high quality whole house heat recovery ventilation system, and I'm guessing the jury's out still on that.
I think the ultimate thing is that they both can work, but you have to understand how they work. And if you are having exhaust, you need to have some sort of make-up air, whether that's from cracking a window or you have a fan bringing in that make-up air.
Yeah. Well, that'll definitely be one to watch with the National Construction Code as well, and to see how results like that can be incorporated into allowing for those options and good design. Talina Edwards is a passionate architect with award-winning experience in holistic sustainable design. After running her own practice for over a decade, Talina joined forces with Andy Marlow in 2022 to become a Director of Envirotecture. She was Deputy Chair of the Australian Passive House Association for 3 years, is a popular presenter at Passive House conferences, and has been featured several times on the Passive House Accelerator.
I am Talina Edwards, a Director of Envirotecture. We are Passive House architects, and it was great to be at the conference this year, and I also got to speak as well, so that was good fun.
You were definitely a highlight at Thrive last year. Yourself and Andy talked about Little Pot of Gold, which we've also talked about on the Passive House podcast. What did you talk about this year?
This year it was a case study about a straw bale passive house. So last year was a lot of theory and research. This year we had a real live project that was looking at reducing that embodied carbon, and so we could sort of draw some conclusions from what our research did, and a built project that reached certified passive house premium. So one of the first straw bale homes to do that in Australia.
Nice. Is this one that's where is that?
It's in regional Victoria, a couple of hours north of Melbourne.
Yeah, so out of the city?
Out of the city, it is an elevation of 500 metres above sea level, so it does get a bit cooler there. But, still warm climate according to the Passive House climate data.
Right. And is being Passive House Premium an advantage for resilience in that type of environment? Because you're a little way away from anything else, really.
Yeah, it is quite a remote site, and they were all off-grid. So the talk really focused on that it started out as a project that was going to be resilient and a refuge and fireproof and natural materials, and then all of those things kind of added up to, well, we may as well do it at Passive House. Why wouldn't we? So Passive House is really just the tool to achieve the client's brief. And on
Nice.
that side. So,
what else was some highlights from the 2 days?
Yeah, look, I really loved seeing all the a mix of case studies from overseas and here. And the big difference here was this year it feels like there was a lot more commercial projects, a lot more Envirotecture talk, looking at embodied carbon and all these alternative materials as well. So as you've already heard a bit about hemp, ours was straw, there was CLT projects. So there was a real focus on highlighting some non-traditional construction methodologies and some non-residential projects. So that's really encouraging to see that growth in the industry and where we're headed as a country.
Some of your work, I think, is defining a new look, a new vernacular for passive house residential buildings in Australia. Is there such a thing yet as a passive house commercial building for the Australian climate?
No, not yet. There's certainly been a lot of different sort of architectural styles and materials and, different aesthetics. So I think that's one of the lessons that's coming out of this. You can do anything, but it pays to have that knowledge up front so you don't run into tricky junctions. We loved hearing from builders, engineers, and as well as the designers about some of those lessons learned and how they would have detailed things differently had they had their time again. So, you can do anything, but it's understanding, what does that look like? So to have those lessons is really helpful.
You got some more highlights for us?
Yeah, I just really wanted to touch on, there was a lot of talk about the around, what are the benefits of Passive House and how could we communicate that with our audiences?
Yep.
And a lot of the times, there was that confirmation that you can't just focus on it being about the dollar saving. And, Kristie touched on that in terms of the health was a really big thing that came out of it as well, the studies that were done by the nurse to really, bring that data home. It's really important, and those health benefits. One of the really interesting talks that I found was from Matthew Francis, who did a bunch of post-occupancy evaluation across a ton of passive houses across Australia. And that was really fascinating that, that one of the best feedback was, what would they do again? What would they change? They had their time all over again. And everyone said, I'd do nothing different at all. It's like perfect, it's great, not change a thing. So that was really awesome to hear. A few people mentioned about overheating or not understanding that the homes might be a little bit hotter than expected. So, we're learning that as an industry in this part of the world and New Zealand. But generally, all the feedback he had was quite overwhelmingly positive, which is really great to hear.
And just to be clear, post-occupancy surveys are not common. They're not normal, are they, in Australia?
Not mandatory at all, no. But to have that data and to be able to learn from it, really, really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it'd be great to see that happen more often, especially for buildings that aren't passive houses as well. So you can kind of get a baseline there.
Yeah. But, the only other thing I wanted to mention, we really loved that how there was a lot of talk around, passive house as part of the solution to moving towards that regenerative ethos, and that we need to make that revolution irresistible, which is what Tim said in his opening keynote. So, that's what we're all here aiming to do.
Were there some key actions to be able to do that? I love the idea of making it irresistible, but what does that look like in the real world?
I think it is continuing to focus on the benefits, but also people being inspired by what's possible and feeling that sense of excitement and joy and connection to what we can do, rather than just going, it might save you money, might improve your air quality. Like, those things are all true, but that's not necessarily what's going to tug on the heartstrings and make that decision. So if a lot of people who make the choice to move down that path, they're sold. They feel it, they want it. And so it's continuing selling it from that perspective, the positives, sharing those inspiring stories.
Yeah, so true. Very cool. Now, so you guys busy?
Yeah, we are keeping busy. We're moving more into a few more Envirotecture projects now as well. So that's really exciting space to be working in.
Finally, we have Andy Marlow. Andy is an early adopter and has been a long-time proponent of Passive House in Australia. His experience in the industry includes teaching, establishing and running an architecture firm, and being director of the Australian Passive House Association. Based in Sydney, he now works with Talina Edwards, and Andy has been a previous guest on the Passive House podcast in numerous episodes.
My name's Andy Marlow. I'm one of the directors at Envirotecture. We are architects and certified passive house designers, and we design lots of passive house buildings.
Talina mentioned some Envirotecture projects. That's a little bit new for Australia. What's going on there?
There's a few now. I think there's about 6 all up across the country, according to the certifiers that are finished. But there's quite a lot in sort of in design or in construction. We've got 2 on site at the moment. One in Orange, which is 1,000 metres above sea level and pretty bloody cold and pretty bloody hot. And one in Sydney, which we're actually running a tour for in a couple of weeks' time. So it's really kind of getting there. They're tricky, as you know, like they're harder to pull off. They take more time, more effort. But, retrofit to us is almost the only game in town. Like, we know how to do the new build stuff. Mostly it's not hard. But, we've got there was a great talk by Lyndon Thorley on retrofit, and there's 10.8 million dwellings in the country. That's a lot. Pretty much all of them are crap, so they pretty much all need to be retrofitted. Literally, you could probably, not quite on one hand, but, there's 99-point-something% are no good. Yeah. So it's a big challenge. So it's getting tackled, and like everything else, it'll get easier, but it's certainly not easy.
Are those ones underway, residential or commercial?
Our ones are both residential.
Yeah.
Unaware of any commercial retrofit ones, but doesn't mean they don't exist, just means I don't know about them.
Is there scope eventually for any sort of standardisation with retrofits in Australia, or is this just such a degree of diversity and complexity that it's going to be every house individually?
I'm not sure that we'll get to a prefabbed version of standard, but what we've learned in the in the ones that we've done already, is that there's, depending on the nature of the thing you start with, there's a couple of, like, the strategy is pretty straightforward each time. Like, you do insulate inside or outside. How do you deal with air tightness? Depends on whether it's a timber building or a masonry building. Like, the strategies are pretty simple. So, you get better at solving some of the details. You know which ones to look for. So the very first one we did, we just did a shirtload of thermal bridge calculations because there was a lot of them. But now we know where the problems are. We've got defaults to start from. So it's like the whole thing just speeds up and gets easier, like everything else, because we've made the mistakes already. Sorry, we've made some mistakes already. I'm sure we'll make new ones because, we're overachievers. So,
how would you sum up this particular conference? Did it have a particular feel? Was there something that made it stand out a little bit different? What was this? What would you be sort of bottom line?
I think more than last year, it was the fact that there was what felt like a lot of people I didn't know. And obviously, I've been coming to these things for quite some time, as you well know. And it was just awesome for there to be basically random strangers, because for so long it was, a whole bunch of lovely people that we all know and everybody's friends, and that's lovely. But it's just good to see the tent get much bigger.
Well, it sounds like Passive House Australia has got a lot bigger fairly recently, and that's a much more than just a linear growth rate.
Yeah, it's going nuts. I mean, the industry, as you mentioned earlier, like, it's slowing down broadly. Like, hazing starts in Australia is down. Last year we built less new hazes than we have for 10 years as a country. And yet pretty much everybody in the passive house world is still pretty much as busy as they were a year ago. So a whole bunch of mates who don't do passive house have got less work on, but all the passive house people are still pretty busy. So I think we could be onto something, it turns out.
Yeah, you think. And how are we going with designing, adapting passive house for those warmer climates and for dealing with summer, longer summers, hotter summers? How's passive house in the summer going?
Well, funnily enough, they go better than a not passive house in the summer.
Yep.
So look, pretty good. We've learned a bit from some of our earlier ones, especially the smaller ones. So the smaller ones, like, smaller buildings, are always harder to make work. You've got more surface area, all of those things. But they also are more prone to overheating because they've got more surface area. So, we've gotten better at that. We're getting better at external shading. We're putting more external shading on buildings.
Is that fixed external shading, or using shutters and movable shading?
Mostly, well, we always do eaves, we nearly always do eaves anyway, so that's mostly like fixed shading stuff.
Yeah.
We do a lot more. For a while, we were to some degree resistant to sort of external blinds, mostly for cost reasons.
Yeah.
But having put them on certain buildings and modelled and tested, and especially we do a lot of work going into future climate files, butchering the PHPP to see what happens at, +4 degrees is our sort of default.
+4, based off current climate. When are the climate files that you're basing that from?
I'm just making it up because you can just put a number in. You can choose any number you like, and I've decided that 4 is probably smart.
Unfortunately, it is.
Well, exactly, and it's because of the average thing you're trying to stress test, so you want a bit more. And I mean, what it really shows you're mostly looking at the relationships between the numbers. Obviously, your heating's going to go down, your cooling's going to go up. That's sort of what is obvious. But you're looking at how those things are changing in relation to each other, and that gives you a bit of a clue as to whether the building is actually sort of more prone to overheating. So we've been running ours. We basically try to scrape in for heating demand because we know that, most people are comfortable below 20 degrees anyway, and also we know the climate's going to warm. So we want to just get across the line for heating demand and get the cooling as low as we possibly can. And that doesn't matter whether it's country Victoria or Sydney or up the coast from Sydney, like, don't care. Like, cooling's the thing. Hard.
That sounds like a topic for a whole episode. We could dive into the details on that one. Any final thoughts on the Thrive, the conference in particular, and just general comments about AFA and Passive House Australia?
Look, the association's going great guns. Alexia's doing an awesome job as CEO. It's growing like crazy. It's been a great conference. They did a great job putting it together. We're getting to stay. There's a certified Passive House hotel in Melbourne, and we're getting to stay in that, which is really nice. So that was Talina.
Is that where you are right now? I can see ventilation.
No.
Oh.
We're in the conference hotel, which is
right.
your average hotel.
Not a Passive House.
We're about to go because the hotel is above a pub, which also has a whiskey bar. So
funny that.
That's where we're going
Right.
after this. So.
Well, I better not hold you up. Thank you very much, Andy, for organising a few people to come and chat to us and getting a sense of the vibe, the energy. Really cool to get to chat to people straight out of 2 days when there's a bit of a buzz there. So I really appreciate you putting that together. Well, hopefully that gives you a bit of a feel for Thrive, the Australian Passive House Conference, running again this year in Sydney. I'm very gutted that I wasn't there, but I'm also very grateful for Andy to be able to collect together this group of speakers immediately after day 2 of the event to get their immediate reactions and thoughts, highlights from the event. Key takeaways from me from that conversation, that quick chat, was that Passive House is doing really well in Australia. That's the key. I think the organisation is really healthy, and that growth in demand and the breadth of Passive House is really exciting. So Passive House is going really strong, and that's extra encouraging because it's pretty warm in parts of Australia. And the thing that's excited me for a while is that Australian designers and builders are gaining confidence in the Passive House principles and applying those and seeing real success of Passive House working very well across a range of climates, including very warm climates, dry climates, and also humid climates. There are some challenges there, particularly around overheating and thinking about glazing and surface area, but there are some great opportunities, and it's really exciting seeing some of the images, and I encourage people to go and check out some of the links in the show notes. Also, just have a look on the Australian Passive House website and see some of the case studies there, have a look at the directory and find out some of the profile pictures of some of the members of that organisation, and you'll get a real sense of just the stunning nature of Passive House homes, mostly homes, but also other buildings now in Australia, and some of the features around big roofs, focusing on shading, still applying lots of insulation and really good quality windows, but just with that extra sensitivity towards the climate and the environment that they're in. So really exciting stuff to see, and I'm hoping that I will be able to attend next year's conference, which has already been scheduled to be in Melbourne next year. Should be very exciting. And yeah, I hope you found that useful to find out what's going on down under as far as Passive House is concerned. Thanks very much for listening in. Please share this podcast with others, and we'll be back with a regular episode this week or next. Thank you very much. This is Matthew Cutler Welsh coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, and reporting on the Australian Passive House Thrive 2024.